Starwalker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, a podcast all about tabletop role-playing games from the perspective of the captain's chair. Greetings, gamer, and welcome to Game Master's Journey, a podcast all about tabletop role-playing games from the perspective of the captain's chair. I'm your host, like Starwalker. We see a lot of kitchen sink RPG settings these days, but do you really want to throw the kitchen sink into your homebrew setting? Join me as I explore this question. Together, we can become game masters truly worthy of the title. Hello, listener and fellow GM and or player. Welcome to the 17th episode of Game Master's Journey. I'm Lex Starwalker, and I'm transmitting this message from the Obsidian Monolith somewhere outside of time and space. So I just have one completely random thing that I want to mention at the top of the show today. If you haven't already done this, go check out the Acquisitions Incorporated games on YouTube. You can find these on the official Wizards of the Coast Dungeons & Dragons YouTube channel. I will have a link to the video in my show notes. In fact, I will have the video embedded in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. This is featuring Chris Perkins as the Dungeon Master, and Patrick Rothfuss is one of the players, which is awesome. I had no idea Pat was so funny. Well, actually, I did. I follow him on Twitter. He's pretty hilarious. And if you can be funny on Twitter, you can be funny anywhere. But it's a lot of fun to watch. This is from PAX East, I guess. And this is the most recent installment in a campaign that they've been doing for quite a while now, like years, since the 4th edition D&D games, and features some people from Penny Arcade and PvP, I think, is another webcomic. And it's a lot of fun. It is hilarious. It is definitely the most entertaining actual play I've watched, at least until the point they get into combat. Then it's a lot less entertaining. I've been going back into the audio files. The first few years that they did this, they didn't have video recording. It's just audio. And getting caught up on it, and I will have a link to that podcast. It's the Dungeons and Dragons podcast. I'll have a link to that on iTunes in my show notes as well. I just have to say, since this is kind of a tangent anyway, that I'm finding the beginning episodes when they're playing 4th edition really hard to listen to. And they really, for me, encapsulate what I did not like about 4th edition. Even though I never played it, I did watch quite a bit of it on like actual play YouTube videos and stuff like that. And I didn't like it. I didn't like watching it. I know I wouldn't like playing it. And that's when I decided to try out Pathfinder. You know, these first few sessions, and Chris Perkins is a great DM, so I'm not really putting this on the shoulders of the DM. The first few sessions are really very little more than combat and maneuvering and counting squares, and it's dreadful to listen to. The 5th edition sessions, on the other hand, are much more enjoyable to watch or listen to, although there's still too much combat. And that's something I've learned watching actual plays and listening to them. It's kind of funny, but the least interesting thing, other than unrelated conversations, in an actual play is actually the combat. It's usually really boring to listen to unless you have a DM and a group of players that are really good at being descriptive and keeping it going and making it exciting. But even then, they tend to really drag on and be a lot longer than you really want them to be. That's something interesting I've noticed, and I do actual plays myself, which I just stream my game sessions, and I've considered the idea that maybe in the future, if I'm going to design a campaign for actual play, that maybe I should have little to no combat in it. That would be interesting. I want to take a minute to thank everyone, all my listeners, for all the great feedback I've been getting on this show. I'm really glad that people are enjoying the show, and I'm really glad that people are digging the new format for listeners of mine that are coming over from GM Intrusions. And I have to say, I am totally blown away with how popular the show has become in such a short time. I honestly expected it to take a lot longer to really catch on, because I feel like it's really going to take quite a few episodes to really kind of show the proof of concept of this show. You know, so far I've discussed D&D 5th edition quite a bit. I did kind of my beginning, like, here's a snapshot of all the different games I've played and run. I've gotten a lot of great positive feedback about my Dungeon Master Guide episodes, and I had asked people, I'd asked you, the listener, you know, do you want me to talk more about this, or have you had enough? And so far, everyone I've heard from has really enjoyed those episodes and would like to hear more about the Dungeon Master's Guide. So I will be doing that in the future. I've also gotten a few emails and messages from people who play other games, who don't even play D&D, but have decided to get the Dungeon Master's Guide after hearing my thoughts about it and how useful I find it for other games as well as Dungeons and Dragons. So if you're someone that's recently gotten into the new Dungeon Master's Guide, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. You can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com, especially if you're someone that bought it after listening to my episode and decided it would be helpful to you. I'd like to hear what you think of it, and if you agree with me that this is going to be helpful to you in other games. But anybody that has an opinion about the new DMG, I'd love to hear from you. I've also talked about Numenera quite a bit on the show. And of course, I just had the 2-part interview with JM and Nick all about 13th Age. So, you know, that's what, 3 games. Okay. So someone listening right now is like, well, this is a podcast about these 3 role-playing games, right? But that's not what it's going to be. Right now, I am running Dungeons and Dragons. I'm running a weekly campaign, Tyranny of Dragons. And I am finishing up my Obsidian Monolith Numenera campaign. We're kind of on an unplanned hiatus right now just because of some scheduling issues, but we're hopefully going to finish that up in April. And I'm going to be running and playing in some organized play for the D&D Adventurers League. I'm going to be running and playing in some games here locally, here in Fort Wayne. And I might even be running some games online. So more about that if it happens. And I'm sure that I'll have some thoughts about organized play in the future as I get some experience with that. I did some organized play with the Pathfinder Society, and my experience with that was not a positive one, and was actually one of the things that kind of turned me off to the game overall. So hopefully the Adventurers League will go better. More on that later. I really want to get a Star Wars Edge of the Empire campaign going, but I have to wait for some time to open up in my schedule for it. I don't have time for it right now. And in fact, I've had to scale back on my gaming I've been doing just because the studio and things like that are taking a lot more of my time. And I'm really looking forward to talking more about Fantasy Flight games, Star Wars games, and we have Force and Destiny coming out pretty soon, and I'm really curious to check that out. So that's a 4th game, right? And there's other games I'm interested in too, other games I've heard about that I want to check out. But my goal with the show is not to give you like a snapshot of a ton of different games. You can find that kind of stuff really easily. It's all over the place out there. Instead, what I really want to do is dig deep into the games that I enjoy. You know, what makes these games unique? What is it about these particular games that work really well, and things that I like about them, and are the reasons I like these games, and what things about these particular games don't work so well? And most importantly, what can we take away from these games to add to our GM toolbox to make us better game masters at whatever game we run and play? So that's kind of where I'm coming from on the show. So as opposed to just, you know, every week hitting you with all these different games and kind of giving you this bird's eye view, I'm going to kind of drill down into games as I play them and really kind of dig into them. So just by the nature of me and the way I like to play and run games, I get really into games for a while and then I kind of move on, except for, you know, certain evergreen games like D&D is kind of an evergreen game for me. I kind of took a break after 4th edition came out, and you know, now I'm back. But I've been playing D&D off and on since the very beginning. So games like that, I'll always kind of be playing here and there. I've always been playing some form of Star Wars, so that's kind of an evergreen game, although the systems have changed a few times for me. But other than that, I tend to run a game for a while and then I want to try the next thing. So as I do that, obviously I'll talk about those games. So over the course of seasons of this show, the games I'm talking about will change and will evolve. So it's not always going to be about D&D. It's not always going to be about Numenera. It's not always going to be about Star Wars. It's going to change. But again, you kind of need like dozens of episodes of history to really see that. And right now you just kind of have to take my word for it. So all that is a meandering way to say that I'm really surprised and happy that the show's doing so well so soon. So let me know if you listen to this show and you enjoy this show or you don't enjoy this show. Send me an email, gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. Let me know what you like about the show. Let me know why you listen to the show, what you want to see more of, or what you don't like about the show. Because, I am casting such a broad net here that, I really need feedback from you, the listener, to let me know what you want to hear so I can kind of use that to help inform future episodes. So today, my topic is the kitchen sink. And this is an idea that came to me a few weeks ago when I was researching D&D settings. So I have been starting to create my own D&D world, which I've mentioned before on the show. At some point, I'm going to do some world building episodes where I just talk about world building and I go into what I'm doing for my world and what I'm coming up with and how I'm designing it, just to kind of help you out if you've never world build before or you just want to see how someone else does it. I'm doing this for D&D, so of course first I wanted to know, well, what else is out there? And I've had direct experience with Dragonlance and Ravenloft and Forgotten Realms and Dark Sun as far as D&D worlds, and Golarion, which in my mind is basically a D&D world. I mean, Pathfinder is kind of like D&D 3.75. I hope I don't offend anybody with that, but that's just how I think of it. So I'm familiar with those, but I saw people talking about Mystara, and I didn't really know anything about Mystara. And there are other worlds as far as D&D that I'm familiar with, or campaign settings that I never really had any experience with, things like Spelljammer or Birthright or Eberron and stuff like that. Before I jumped into the deep end of creating my own setting, I wanted to see, what was out there, just to see if maybe one of these other settings was exactly what I was looking for, and why reinvent the wheel if I don't need to, right? So I found a couple web pages that kind of listed all the different D&D settings and talked about what they were like, and this term kept coming up, which is kitchen sink settings. So what is a kitchen sink setting? Well, a kitchen sink setting, at least my understanding of it, is it's one that has quote unquote something for everyone. Right? So no matter what flavor of fantasy game you want to play, for instance, let's take D&D as an example here. No matter what flavor of D&D you want to play, you can play it in this world. So kind of the epitome of a kitchen sink setting, I think, is the Forgotten Realms. Other examples of kitchen sink settings are Mystara for D&D and the Golarion setting for Pathfinder. And I think even you could argue the Ninth World for Numenera. So I'll just use Forgotten Realms as an example here, because it's probably the one that the most of us are the most familiar with. So there are tons of different areas of the realms that are based on different places or time periods in Earth history. So, for example, we have Maztica, which is, loosely based on Central America. We have Zakara, which is based on the Middle East. Karatur, based on China and Japan in different historical periods. Aluskan, based on Norse cultures. The Ice Hunters, based on Eskimo cultures. The Moonshays, based on Celtic cultures. Rashomon, based on Russia. Chisentra and Thraskell, based on Greece. Chandath, based on mercantile Italy. Amun, based on medieval Spain. Chult, based on Africa, etc., etc., etc. Now, these can be and are debated by people, what's based on what and what isn't and things like that. But the point here is that we see analogs from a wide variety of times and places in the Forgotten Realms. Now, we can argue until the cows come home about what's an analog for what, but the point is that we see them and that there's a lot of different ones, right? The Galarian world of Pathfinder is very similar. So even if direct parallels to real world time and places aren't so obvious, these kitchen sink settings still offer a wide array and variety of play styles and themes. So for instance, Galarian, which I don't know a ton about, I didn't play a lot of Pathfinder, but mainly, my impression of Galarian was that it's mainly high fantasy, epic fantasy. But then there are places that are very different. Like there's Numeria, where it's this kind of sci-fi / science fantasy / magipunk / steampunk kind of place, right? There are places that are more horror. There are places that are more low fantasy and stuff like that. And so if you want to run Pathfinder, no matter what kind of game you want to run, whether you want to run a horror game or high fantasy or low magic or steampunk or whatever you want to do, chances are really good you're going to find some place in Galarian that you can do that in and it'll fit. Forgotten Realms is the same way. And a lot of times this is marketed or presented to us as a good thing, right? It's like, hey, we've got something for everyone here in Galarian or here in Forgotten Realms. And this is awesome because no matter what you want to do, there's a place in the Forgotten Realms that you can do it. And it's sold to us as that's a good thing, right? And so kind of my point in this episode is to get you to ask yourself, is this really a good thing? And is this something, if I'm making my own setting, is this something I want to emulate or not? So the most common criticisms that I hear about the Forgotten Realms, and I hear a lot of criticisms about the Forgotten Realms. It seems like for every one person you find that loves the realms, there's someone that hates it. And most of the criticisms that I hear or I see boil down to the kitchen sink nature of the realms. People will say that Forgotten Realms has no theme. There's no theme, tying it together. There's no, what is the Forgotten Realms? You can't answer that question in a short sentence, right? It's like, well, are we talking Maztica? Are we talking Karator? Are we talking the Dale Lands? Are we talking Chult? These you'd have totally different games depending on which of those areas you ran your Forgotten Realms in. And there's also the Arabian Nights setting that's part of Forgotten Realms. I can't remember what it's called right now, but you know what I'm talking about. Al-Qadim. Al-Qadim is in Forgotten Realms too. An Al-Qadim game is totally different than a Chult game or a Dale Lands game, right? Totally different. Or a Waterdeep game. So Forgotten Realms has no theme. There's really nothing holding it together. It's this kind of mess of random cultures and random styles of fantasy, different flavors of fantasy, not to mention time periods ranging from the Dark Ages through to the Renaissance. So if you're going to create your own setting, an important question to ask is, do you want it to be a kitchen sink setting? Are you going to try to do what settings like Forgotten Realms do and say, oh, well, this is my African part of the world, and this is my Native American part of the world, and this is my Chinese part of the world, or whatever. And obviously those are huge generalizations, right? Like African, Native American, Chinese. I mean, you'd have to drill down a lot farther than that to actually get to something like specific that you could actually base something on, right? But the point is are you going to do that? Or are you going to say, this part of the world is for if I want to run a horror game, and this part of the world is if I want to run a high magic, high fantasy game, and this part of the world is for if I want to run more of a steampunk game, and this part of the world is if I want to run more of a gritty, mundane, Game of Thrones type fantasy game, right? Do you want to do that or not? So personally, I am not a fan of kitchen sink settings, if you can't tell that already. I'd rather have different settings for my different flavors of fantasy or whatever genre I'm running. This works for science fiction too, right? If you're running a science fiction game, do you want to be able to run anything from military sci-fi to space opera to mundane sci-fi to, dystopian sci-fi all in one place? Or are you better off having different settings for those different types of sci-fi, right? So going back to D&D as our example, the settings that I've enjoyed the most and that have captured my imagination the most have not been kitchen sink settings. I instantly think of Ravenloft and Dark Sun, which were both very kind of focused settings as far as their theme. You know, Ravenloft is a horror, you know, fantasy horror, gothic horror, depending on, you know, there's different parts, different realms of Ravenloft, so they're all a little different. But overall, as a setting, it's very much a horror setting, right? And it's very much like there's not a lot of monsters in Ravenloft compared to like Forgotten Realms, you know, things like that. Dark Sun is much more of a, you know, fantasy setting based on something like Dune, where you're very much concerned about the elements and about survival, and life is hard, and the races are very different, right? An elf on Athos is very different than an elf on Krynn. A halfling on Athos is way different than a halfling on Toril, right? So these are the settings that really stick out in my mind. You know, if you're going to ask me what's a cool D&D setting, I wouldn't be like Forgotten Realms. I'd say probably Dark Sun or Ravenloft. Those are really cool. And I think it's better to have different settings for different themes and moods and genres than to cram them all into one setting. So yes, you can run just about any flavor of D&D or Pathfinder game you can imagine into Forgotten Realms or Golarion, and you can find a place where it will fit. But to me, that's not a feature. That's not a positive thing to me. Neither of those worlds have an easily definable identity to them like Ravenloft or Dark Sun does. You can't tell me what Golarion is in a sentence, and what the theme and the feel and the mood and the genre of Golarion is in a sentence, or Forgotten Realms, because the truth is it's a lot of different ones. I think the more kitchen sink a setting becomes, the more generic and uninspiring it becomes, and the less it kind of sticks with you as a player. One of the first steps of designing a campaign for me is deciding what kind of tone and theme I want to focus on in that campaign. With a coherent setting like Dark Sun or Ravenloft, the setting itself gives you a great place to start. You know, if I've decided I'm going to run a game in Ravenloft, I already know I'm going to be doing horror, right? If I decide I'm running a game in Dark Sun, I already know that it's going to be gritty, things are going to be tough, you know, I'm not going to have gods, stuff like that. A setting like Forgotten Realms doesn't really give you any help in this regard, right? Again, you have to drill down to get to where you have anything helpful. You have to decide, well, where exactly in the Forgotten Realms am I going to run my game? Because basically each of these different little settings in Forgotten Realms might as well be its own world, right? Mastika and Karator and all these different things, they might as well be different worlds because they're totally different games. That brings me to my next point, which is that these kitchen sink settings can really start to break down for you if your PCs travel widely around the world. So, you know, in the Forgotten Realms, if your PCs are traveling the world, they can easily go from high fantasy to low fantasy to horror to science fiction. And it's really hard to do that, maybe even impossible to pull that off in a way that every player at your table is going to enjoy it and think that's cool. You know, you start mixing genres like that, unless you really pull it off well, which I'm not even sure is possible, you're going to have at least one player at your table going, this is not what I signed up for. So, and part of this is expectations, right? As a GM, just as with any kind of a storyteller, in the beginning of the story, you want to set expectations for your player, for your reader, and then you want to fulfill those expectations by the end of the story. And if you don't do that, they're not going to be happy with it, right? I have a story here of a DM I had in high school, and he was one of those people, he was always down to play in my games, but he very rarely ran games of his own. You know, so one day he decided he was willing to run something. So I was super excited because I rarely got to actually play in a D&D game because I was almost always the game master or the dungeon master. So I made a character. I made a half-elf fighter wizard. He let me start at like 3rd level or something. I don't remember. And I had this whole idea for this character, you know, because this was actually a campaign he was running just for me. So I kind of assumed that like he would kind of fit things to my character, you know? So I made, you know, this half-elf fighter wizard. I was like really excited with like exploring like playing a fighter mage and like mixing, you know, sword fighting with magic. I think he used like a great sword or something. And I was really excited to play this character. So long story short, the first gaming session, I kid you not, my character, who was, I think we were in Dragonlance or Forgotten Realms, I don't remember. We were in some, generic fantasy setting. My character literally gets abducted by aliens. Like, first thing that happens in the campaign. So now I'm on this spaceship, and it was like watching, what was that movie, Fire in the Sky? It was very much like that. Like, I'm on the ship, I'm in like this gooey like egg sack thing I have to get out of, and then I'm wandering around the ship trying to figure out how to get out of it. And I hated it. It was one of the least likable gaming experiences I've ever had. And the reason was because I went in making a character and expecting a, D&D fantasy game, and instead I was given a sci-fi game. And my character completely did not fit into the story. I mean, I was having to deal with technology and all this stuff, and here I was, a fighter mage. Right? Like, there was no use for any of my skills. There was nothing to fight. There was no use for magic. If the guy had said, hey, I'm going to run this weird thing where you're going to start off in a D&D world, but instantly you're going to be on a spaceship and we're going to go sci-fi with it, make a character that you think would work well with that. Like, I probably would have been on board. I probably would have been like, oh, that sounds interesting. And it would have been a lot of fun. But, he didn't do that. He just like blindsided me with it. It wasn't what I was expecting. It wasn't, what he'd set up. And I hated it. And so I think that that's kind of something as a GM that we need to think about, right? What expectations are you setting for your players? And as soon as you pick a setting, if it's, a published setting that they know about, if you say I'm running in Ravenloft, there's expectations attached to that right away. They're going to expect a horror game, right? If you say I'm running in Dark Sun, it's going to be different expectations. If you say I'm running in Waterdeep, there's going to be certain expectations, right? And so if you're running in Forgotten Realms and you're traveling everywhere from Chult to, Waterdeep to Maztica and everywhere else, unless the players all know going in that you're going to be doing that, you're going to have unhappy players, because maybe you started in Waterdeep and everybody wanted this like, high intrigue, city-based campaign, and now they're in the jungles of Chult and they're like, what the hell's going on? So I think you're much better off deciding what kind of game you want to play, what kind of game you want to run, and then building a world that really features that theme, tone, and genre. First ask yourself, what kind of story do I want to tell? And then what would be the perfect setting for that story? And then there you have the genesis of your world. And then when you're building your world, go small to big. And only create what you need. So don't start out with, here's all the continents and here's all the countries and here's 2,000 years of history and all this crap. No, start out with, what do your players need for the first session? Well, maybe you're starting in a town, right? So you need to know a little bit about that town. You need to know, maybe a day's travel in every direction from that town, kind of what's going on. And that's all you need to start with. And then you can kind of build your world based on where the players explore from there. So start small, go big instead of the other way around. Only create what you need. And then in the future, if you decide you want to run a totally different game, so say your first campaign, you run high fantasy, right? And you build a world for that. Then in the future, if you decide I want to do a horror game, then you can make a different world for that. Again, you can start small, go big, create only what you need. Go for breadth, not depth. Right? So don't, come up with all this stuff for every little thing and all these histories and stuff that you don't need. Only come up with what you need, and come up with stuff in kind of a wide range, like geographically speaking, so that the players can go any direction and you're okay. You have an idea of what's out there, but don't come up with a lot for any given thing, right? Because they may never go there, and, why do things that you're not going to need? And I think that if you take this approach, coming up with a setting that really fits the campaign that you want to run, and not trying to juxtapose all those different campaigns and settings together into one setting, I think it will result in a much more enjoyable and much more memorable setting or settings for your players than, some kitchen sink setting ever will. And, in my opinion, the only way that a kitchen sink setting really works well at all is to have each different theme or genre area so separated by either distance or impassable barriers like mountains or oceans or whatever, that they never mix. So you don't end up with this problem of destroying your player's suspension of disbelief because they cross a line and go from high fantasy to steampunk, right? And you totally lose any idea of theme or cohesion that you had in your world. So if you are going to separate things so that it's not easy to travel from one to the other, they might as well be different worlds anyway at that point. And then you have a lot more space for each of those worlds to expand and build upon them if you end up really liking the setting and your characters or your players really like the setting, and you can go from there. So that's kind of my take on the kitchen sink thing. So I'm very much anti kitchen sink, especially, it's fine if you're running in a published setting. Like right now I'm running Tyranny of Dragons, which is set in the Forgotten Realms. And yeah, I could put that in any world I wanted. But it's easier just to do it in Forgotten Realms. And I'm doing that, and it's fine. I'm not a huge fan of Forgotten Realms. There are aspects of it I like and that I will probably use in my world that I'm creating. But I'm not a big fan of it. But that's what Tyranny of Dragons is in, so that's what I'm doing. So if you're using published settings, then, that's great. Although I would still suggest that you find a more focused setting that is what you want. So if you're wanting to do horror, don't do it in the Forgotten Realms. Do it in Ravenloft. If you're wanting to do, something like Dune, don't do it in Forgotten Realms. Do it in Dark Sun, that kind of thing. But if you're creating your own world from scratch, I think you're better off figuring out exactly what you want from your world, what kind of world you want it to be, what kind of feel you want it to have, and then creating the world around that and really embracing that and seeing where that takes you, instead of saying, oh, this continent's going to be, Wuxia, and this continent's going to be Stone Age, and this continent's going to be Renaissance and have gunpowder and stuff, and this continent's going to be steampunk, and because it just seems like what it is, which is just a bunch of random things smashed together that don't really fit. All right, well, that is going to wrap up the 17th episode of Game Master's Journey. Thank you so much for joining me. If you would like to reach me, you can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. Definitely let me know what you think about kitchen sink settings. If you disagree with me, I'd love to hear it and hear your reasons. Or if you agree with me, I'd love to hear that too. And I'd also love to hear, what's your favorite setting? If you play D&D or a similar game, what's your favorite setting? Because you can use settings from other games too, right? So like, if I really like the 13th Age setting or one of the 13th Age settings, I could totally use that in D&D, right? So what's your favorite setting? I'd love to hear from you, and why. You can find me on Google+, just search for Lex Starwalker. You can follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker. Please visit the website, starwalkerstudios.com. There you can find all kinds of helpful links in the show notes, as well as a link to our Game Master's Journey Google+ community. You should join us there. I think we're close to 500 people strong now. Lots of fun is had on that community. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to support the show, a great way that you could do so is to head on over to iTunes or Stitcher, whichever way you get your podcasts, and leave us a review. Would really appreciate it. It really helps with the rankings on those sites. It helps new people find the show, helps it show up in searches and stuff like that. And I really appreciate people who leave reviews. Really appreciate it. I would like to send a special thank you out to Nick for your 5-star reviews on iTunes. Thank you very much. I really, really appreciate it. Oh, and that reminds me, if you use iTunes and you leave a review and you're not in America, let me know. And even better yet, send me a link to your review, because when I look at reviews in iTunes, I only see the American one. iTunes is really dumb in a lot of ways, and one of the ways it's really dumb is it splits things up by country. So if you're in Australia and you leave a review, for me to see your review, I actually have to go to the Game Master's Journey page on the Australian iTunes, which is really stupid, but it's the way it is. So it occurred to me the other day, it's like, I could have Australian listeners or European listeners or Canadian listeners who've left reviews, and I've never thanked you because I don't even know, because I never go check those other sites. So if you are one of those people and you leave a review, shoot me an email or tweet me or whatever and let me know, and I will try to find it. If you can give me a link, even better. Actually, to do a link, all you do is right click on the image of the podcast and there'll be a copy link in the pop-up menu. But that'd be great. I wonder if I've gotten any reviews from my international listeners on any of my shows, and I never knew. So if that's you, I apologize. I never thanked you, but there's why. Let me know, and I will definitely rectify that. So thank you again very much for tuning in and for listening to Game Master's Journey. I will have another episode of the Obsidian Monolith coming out soon. I'm not sure. Probably not this week. I've been cranking those out really fast, but I'll have another one coming soon. And again, I'm going to have the world building episodes sometime in the future, but I will definitely have another regular show next week. So thanks again for listening. I'm Lex Starwalker. Game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney.